Welcome to the Future of Work, More Human. My name is Max Chapovsky. I help companies around the country find and negotiate the leases for their office space, ensuring that the space they have is the space they need and reflects and supports their company culture. The Future of Work is a series exploring our evolving relationship with work, the how, where, and why, the trends and technologies disrupting and improving the workplace, and perspectives from thought leaders on the new normal. We've covered a lot on this show, from culture to workplace, office development to the metaverse. At the center of it all are, of course, people. We build companies to make a difference for people. We go to great lengths to hire the best people we can find. And some of us spend our days thinking about the ultimate altruism, which is creating a better world for our kids, for people we may never meet, and for people that haven't even been born yet. The future is an unknown variable. We think we know what's coming and we try to plan for it, control what we can control. And yet, despite our best intentions, so much still falls into the don't know what we don't know category. Some might say we are living in a calamitous world, from the more immediate issues of inflation, polarizing politics, and war, to the longer-term generational impacts of climate change. It's easy to paint a dark picture. But I would offer that rising all around us is a less cynical generation of activists who believe they can make a difference. And it is our responsibility to nurture this generation at home and at work to get them ready to meet the many challenges that await them. We have to arm them with the tools and mindsets they need to architect the future they deserve. Leadership is undergoing the most transformational shift, maybe ever. Not because of any one technology, but because for the first time, we are recognizing our humanity and realizing that if we create a truly human-centric work environment where people feel seen, we will revolutionize the world of work. The challenge is that to really recognize our humanity and structure our work environment around it, we have to update everything from compensation, policies and procedures, physical spaces, management approaches, and more. It's a lot to tackle, but after all, the future is at stake. I'm very excited for our guests today to share their perspectives, and especially excited to meet two people who have apparently hacked the day to include 30 hours, up from 24. Suzanne Muchin is a clinical associate professor at the Kellogg School of Management and is best known for teaching Selling Yourself and Your Ideas, as well as teaching classes in entrepreneurship, innovation, and women's leadership. Suzanne is also a co-founder and CEO of Bonfire, a company created to ignite the power of women to change the rules of the modern workforce. Suzanne is a leader in Chicago's entrepreneurship community, helping build the brands and social impact strategies for some of the city's most well-known organizations and initiatives, including 1871, Matter, M-Hub, Impact Engine, and P33. In 2012, she was inducted into the Chicago Entrepreneurship Hall of Fame. She lives in the city, where she can often be found running or walking on the lakefront, accompanied by her husband or one of her 5 adult children. High five for that, depending on her mood and theirs. Dr. Garry Cooper is the co-founder and CEO of Rheaply, a Chicago-based tech company that enables Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and universities to better visualize, quantify, and utilize their physical resources. He also serves on the boards of P33 and 1871 and is a general partner at Long Jump Ventures. Before Rheaply, Garry served on the faculty of Northwestern University and facilitated supply chain and performance improvement for enterprise businesses at Ernst & Young. Garry has received recognition on the Forbes Next 1000 and Crain's 40 Under 40 lists. He's been recognized as a scholar at Google for Entrepreneurs, a 2021 Emerson Collective Dial Fellow, and he was selected as one of the 100 most inspiring entrepreneurs by Goldman Sachs in 2021 and 22. And this is, to be perfectly clear, a partial list of accomplishments. Somewhere along the way, Garry managed to get a PhD in neuroscience from Northwestern University, a certificate in management from Kellogg, and math and chemistry degrees from Indiana University. Oh, and he also holds a US patent. Suzanne and Garry, welcome.
Thanks, Max.
So let's start kind of at the beginning. What drove you to start your company? And Garry, why don't we start with you? What problem is it that you're trying to solve?
Thanks for having me, Max. And I'm so excited to be coming with one of my besties. And hi out there. This is like a very new medium for me, so I'm really excited about this. What drove me to starting Rheaply and why do I care about this problem? Actually had nothing to do with sustainability. Our business is completely about sustainability. It's completely about climate change. I had no training in that, and that's not the world I was thinking about. I was thinking about a very tactical problem that every researcher has ever faced, which is there's not enough funding for research, scientific research. Must we remember how fast we advanced vaccines for COVID over the quarantine? All that's based in decades long scientific research that's being done in all the big and powerful universities around the world right now. And all that stuff costs money. And so I just kept seeing the reality from friends of mine who were in other laboratories who didn't have the funding to do the experiments that are important to get some of these breakthroughs. So I kept thinking, well, if we can't get more funding, can we just use the things that we already have more, right? Stretching the dollar, using things that we've already bought, and sharing the things that we already have with other laboratories that maybe can use them more. And it turns out that that idea of sharing, something that Uber and Airbnb kind of popularized in the kind of consumer markets, should be something that we should be thinking about in the business world, especially in the worlds of academia and the nonprofits worlds, where we're already always facing budget issues. So Rheaply's kind of founding DNA was around sharing in the business world. And what we've done is figure out that actually sharing in the business world is central to our climate fight.
Fascinating. Suzanne, what about you?
So I just want to say that when I first encountered Garry, he was an adorable Techstars, whatever you would call it, a participant. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he was going to be a rock star then. It was very clear. But it is so true, Garry, that like that focus that you had then, I can see the growth path from where you are then to where you are now. But also the very big pivot that came, right, that led you to the current focus of Rheaply. But I think what's really interesting is the common DNA is still there, right, which is what I think keeps it holding together, which is really cool, So what problem am I solving? So we all know that chart that shows how work isn't working for women. You know, it shows all the discrepancies, right, between who's moving up in management and women of color in particular, and how there's more men getting raises in the wage gap. We all know those charts. So the question is not whether or not there's a problem, but what problem are we actually solving? So for Bonfire, we are looking at the pipeline. We're looking at the question of how do we actually figure out how the women you already have at your company, the women who are sitting right in front of you, are going to be the drivers of creating the culture change in your company that will help everyone rise, that will help everyone in the company actually create a more engaged culture. Because at the end of the day, no matter how you look at companies today and the problems that they're facing, whether you look at the Great Resignation or the talent war or anything else, our workforce is not engaged. And we know that the drivers of some of the fixes for those problems, whether it's keeping people healthier from a mental health point of view, whether it's engaging diverse teams, leading diverse teams, joining the ERGs and leading them. Who's doing that? Women are doing that. Who's getting paid for doing that? No one. So we have a problem. And Bonfire is equipping those leaders to lead that change. And I will just say that there's no company, small, big, different, that isn't feeling the impact of this right now. So Bonfire women go through our talent development accelerator, which is a 6-month program that their companies pay for, because this is an enterprise-facing model. The problem exists within a company and the problem needs to be solved by the company, paid for by the company, but they're also the beneficiary of it, as is the women who go through our program. So it's global. Obviously, during COVID, we pivoted to a platform and we deliver our product that way. And our women are going to change the future of work for everybody.
I love that. I love that. You know, it's interesting. You're both in very mission-driven companies. You both care deeply about the underlying mission. And I feel like every successful founder has this proud parent moment when they see one of their people do something that just really reflects their true belief in that mission. Just perfect alignment, right? And so I'd love to maybe have you talk about a time that you saw an employee embodying your mission and how that made you feel, because I'm sure you don't forget these kind of things.
Should I go first?
Yeah, you can go first. Sure.
I'm sure Suzanne, I wanted her to go first, so I'll go first. There's like maybe 1,000 examples of this. It actually is my most favorite thing, to your point, Max, is that, and they're not initiated by me. They're not even, they're not even incentivized by Rheaply. They are. So one of the ones that comes to mind actually is around this time of year. So around the holidays, right, we recognize in a company where we're trying to equally distribute the physical things in the world, we remember that there are people, even here in Chicago, that live in parts of our community that are left behind in the current economy. They don't have the same resources that we do in other parts of the city. So one of the things that was undertaken at our company was, okay, especially after the unfortunate situation with George Floyd, how could our tiny little company play a big role in that? And so one of the things we did in 2020 around Christmas is we bought for all of our employees and for all of our customers, either gifts or gift cards from either women-owned or Black-owned small businesses on the south and west sides of our city. A lot of those actually were from what I'll call eco brands. So brands that are either using recycled material or some type of upcycled material. And that just spoke, I didn't even know what was happening. I got a gift from my company in the mail and I thought, how lovely, how amazing. And so I am actually inspired by my team. I know that some people will say that, oh, they heard me talk or they really believe in the mission and they really wanted to get behind it. And I thank them for that. But really, actually, the inspiration is the other way. When I see people doing even those small initiatives, things that don't hit our bottom line, it doesn't come up in a board meeting, it's not in a spreadsheet. It makes me think, not only are we building the right thing here at Rheaply, we're building it with the right people.
Totally.
So I'm going to give two quick examples because we impact women and we also impact companies, right? So Umi Grisby is one of our women who was in our first cohort. And what's crazy about that first cohort is we launched in January of 2020 as an in-person offering, right? This space behind me was actually a classroom intended to bring women physically together. January of 2020, 75 women paid for by their companies, $10,000 a piece, right? We got through 3 of those gatherings before the world stopped, right? And that cohort was just exceptional, as first cohorts often are, but they went through the pivot, right? In April, they were on Zoom and going with it, and they're phenomenal women. But Umi in particular, she was working for the city of Chicago, and Bonfire became a kind of calling for her and gave her something that was very validating for her. She felt very seen. She felt very heard. We also, don't forget, went through George Floyd with this cohort. It was actually a 9-month cohort, the first one. So we went through a lot with that group. She has gone on. She's now the chief of staff for the Chicago Women's Foundation. She became one of our small group leaders. And she's almost now just feeling like, what's next? She's written a book while she's been on about women's health since she joined Bonfire. So, and there are, we've had 3,500 women go through the program now. So I can name, hundreds more where that came from. But the other company I want to talk about is Motorola. So I was on the founding team at P33, and I was the co-chair of the communication committee with Greg Brown, who is the CEO of Motorola Solutions. And he always wants to remind me that he was the first in on Bonfire, that the minute I told him about it, he was like, we're in, right? And at the time, I was only allowing companies to put 5 women in at a time in that first cohort, because I didn't want any one company to like dominate that group of 75. So he sent us 5 women. Since then, I believe they have sent 1,000.
That's crazy.
Of that 3,500.
Wow.
They have and this is global. I mean, they have women all over the world. And this isn't just from Greg. I mean, he started, right? But they have a team inside Motorola who has just completely bought in to what Bonfire is doing for their pipeline. And they see how it's actually not just impacting the women at Motorola, but really spreading through their culture as something that is very empowering there. So these are companies, and I could, name others, BMO Harris, others who have just made ongoing significant commitments that they're doing, not just because of one woman or 2 or 3, but because they know that it's good for the company.
As an entrepreneur, you have to kind of believe in something that others around you may not believe in, right? And sort of against all odds. And what I think is so underrated early on in the entrepreneurial journey is validation. Like every little bit of validation, whether it's internal, getting a gift in the mail, employees doing the right thing without you even incentivizing them, or if it's external, having that first person believe in you so much that they send more people than you probably would have ever imagined when you started the company, and continue to be such a big fan. I mean, that's just amazing. I want to talk a little bit about culture. So culture is an interesting topic because it will coalesce and evolve on its own, whether you pay attention to it or not. And so if you get it right, it can make a big difference in the company, in talent acquisition, obviously, but it really adds to the bottom line. So Fortune magazine has an annual ranking of the 100 best companies to work for. And what's interesting is, on average, an equal weighted portfolio of public companies on this list earned an excess annual return between 2 and almost 3% when compared to the market, which is interesting. But what makes it really interesting is that in times of crisis, the portfolio outperformed the market by nearly 20% a year, which makes perfect sense, because if you have the right people and they're in it for the right reasons, then adversity is just a speed bump that they will figure out how to get around. So I want to talk a little bit about the culture at your companies. And Suzanne, let's start with you. How much of that culture was intentional and sort of guided versus organic?
I think our culture has really evolved, to be honest. I think that in the beginning, it was chaotic, to be honest, because we launched during COVID, right? Yeah. So there was, we tried very hard before we launched to do all the right things, right? To have value statements, and, we went through all the exercises and did all the right things. But when COVID came, all of that just gets tossed up in the air, and you have to kind of reinvent yourself. We must have reinvented our culture 4 different times, to account for all the variables during that time. And I don't want to paint a really beautiful picture. It was hard. We lost people. We changed teams. We, made mistakes, all kinds of things, because everybody was flying by the seat of their pants and also just to stay alive, and so part of it was how do we keep everybody employed? How do we not lose people? And there's trade-offs in that moment from a cultural point of view. And so there are things I'm really proud of during that time. Like, we didn't lay off people, and that's something I will forever be proud of. And we didn't have mass, we didn't have people leaving. I will also say there are things that I know that if you go back and do a pandemic over again, you would have done things differently. But coming out of that, when we had the breathing room to really reset, I think we took a lot of things into account that have really shaped the culture. And I can just name like 4 things that I think are very Bonfire-esque. And, I think that Garry and I both really feel this way, and it's very in keeping with this podcast, that like our culture is very human, right? So we're very human centric. All of our policies are very much about, how we keep people working the way they want to work, where they want to work, how their work styles and individual people really want and need to feel at work. Like, the question of how do you want to feel at work is really important. The second thing is we're very much about humor, and like everybody here, like laughter is something whenever I walk in the door, I always tell people, if I get here late, the first thing I hear is laughter, like always. It's a very, like, unlike Jason Fried in 37 Signals, where they'll say like it's like a library, like here it's like bursting with laughter. So that's just a big part of our culture. I would say the third thing is it really is about like, I have your back. People really do try to step in and step up when other people need them to. And I think that's really true. We've tried to eliminate, like, there's no water cooler. I mean, I'm sure there is, right? Because you can't eliminate it entirely, but it's just like, that's not a thing. Like, where that's not cool. You don't get rewarded for that, right? Nobody tries to make that like a thing that they're known for. And then the final thing I would say is that we're very validating. Like, when you walk in, there's a lot of like, oh my God, you look amazing. Did you get your hair cut? Like, I love there's a lot of validation, because I think people want, when we see each other, which isn't every day of the week, for people to feel really good coming in. Like, I see you, like I see you, you're here, those are big parts of our culture.
Yeah. Like, no matter how bad your day is, if you walk in and somebody's like, you look fabulous today,
100%.
How could you not just leave whatever BS you came in with at the door?
Right. And of course, these things that I'm telling you are also reflected in our policies, right? Like our HR, we work really, really hard to back up our culture with policies that matter to our people. So I don't just want to mention things that are sort of light or, personality driven. These things are backed up by our HR policies.
Yeah, it's important. Garry?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go work for Bonfire.
Please, by all means, Garry, by all means.
So I would say it's a bit of both. So I think, I had very, very, typical experiences working in a lab for 12 years and the culture of that. Working in a big consulting firm and working in that and being successful and not hating that culture, but really understanding what those 4 walls look like. So I was actually very intentional when I started Rheaply about what, at least conceptually, I wanted people to feel at work. And one of the things I wanted them to feel at work is a place for them. At Ernst & Young, I was a number. I still remember my number. It was a 6-digit number. I call in to get help. I gave them my number. I go into the system. I type in my number. And it was important at the founding of the company. It's important when we have 10,000 people at the company that we find a way for people to be themselves at work, not a number. And so the way that we try to accomplish that are some of the same things that Suzanne talked about. So we try to champion simplicity. We try to champion humor and uniqueness and color. And we try in design. And we try to, We have literally all kinds of Slack channels around things like home cooking. I didn't create that. So what I say about it's intentional, it was intentional at the beginning, is that I wanted people to transition from home. Now we don't really transition from room to room, into work, not normally missing the home outside of the people that they are with. I wanted them to feel a second home. And so I think to create that, you have to, I don't think there's a playbook, at least in my opinion. I think every company has their own way of doing that. And but one thing that you know if it's happening is that you get into this organic space where you start seeing a proliferation of, you know, home cooking or plant-based Slack channels, or when people are setting up groups to buy from small business owners for Christmas, or not buying from anyone for Christmas, or when people are calling you, the CEO, on, hey, could you have said that a little bit better? Or, you know, I felt this kind of way, and not feeling like they're going to get fired or admonished or reprimanded for saying, hey, are you really living by our values? So I think that I was intentional, but I think these days it's a machine, and I actually have to live up to the best expressions of that machine as a CEO.
You know, what's interesting to me is I find that the best leaders are vulnerable, and that's really, really hard to do. And it became even harder during the pandemic when there were so many times where the only answer you could give was, I don't know, right? I don't know what's next, right? I don't know what I'm doing. I have no idea what we should be doing next. And so, but people appreciate that. I think employees really appreciate vulnerability. So I'd be curious to know, because, you know, what's interesting is our friend Amanda Lannert talks about leading with trust. She says, you have to be vulnerable first, and your people will follow. So what I would love to know is, how do you do that? How do you lead with trust and put yourself out there with vulnerability first, without the expectation of getting it back from your people?
I love this question.
Well, if you love it, why don't you go first, Garry?
Okay. Well, I probably could write an essay in response. So I'm buffering a little bit and trying to sort my thoughts. But the first thing that occurs to me is, so, and I'm sure this is definitely the case at Bonfire, we have a set of values. And one of they're a long list, but what I try to do these days, or not these days, every single employee at Rheaply comes and meets with me their very first week at Rheaply. And the thing that we go to together is our mission, our vision, and our core values. We don't talk about sales strategy. We don't talk about product building. I like for you to hear from me what our mission and vision and our values are, and why we think about these things. So that you can espouse them to other employees. So the framework that I give for people to live out the values at Rheaply is to do three things: to listen, to delight, and to help. So when I think about how do I build trust and vulnerability and all those things, the first thing is asking for and giving help when I need it. In the case you just talked about in COVID, we were a 7-person company. We were all in one room in a WeWork. I never thought about a digital infrastructure, and now we're 65 people to support that. We had to build that. I go on Slack the morning that I say we're back in the office. I'm going to need your help. New account executive comes into Rheaply, few levels down on the org chart from me, and I can see the questions that they're asking aren't exactly the right questions, or they're struggling with a customer's pushes. I reach out to that AE and I say, hey, let's have a chat. I can help you here. So I think the first thing for me in building trust is to be like, I'm building this with you. You're building this with me. And if we can help each other and help our customer and help our supporters, that's going to build the trust. I don't have the answers, but together we can figure it out.
I love that.
So I would say there are three maybe themes that I can speak to briefly. One is a show not tell. The other is a feedback model that we have. And the third is true questioning, authentic questioning all day long versus having answers as what we value. So the first is, and we have a really unusual situation at Bonfire because we have two founders, right? I'm a co-founder with Rachel Bello, who is my longtime 25-year business partner and best friend. And anyone who's listened to our podcast knows, like, we really have it out, right? We in front of our team because we trust each other that way. There's so much trust between Rachel and me that our team needs to get comfortable with the two founders having it out, like not at each other's throats, like in a hostile, mean way, but like ideas, like disagreeing and not trying to sugarcoat that. And I know that it makes people uncomfortable at first, but they have to see it. And I'm by name the CEO, right? I'm the CEO between Rachel and me. And she gets to really, in front of everybody, question fundamental things that I'm saying in front of the staff. So that's a show not tell that is just there all the time from the beginning. That's the first thing. The second thing is Craig Wortman at Kellogg has this feedback model that we use all the time that is, did well, do differently. What do you think you did well? What would you do differently? What do you think you did well? What would you do differently? It's so fast. It's so easy. We use it all the time. We use it after every event that we do with our members. So what did we all think we did well? What would we do differently? Did well, do differently. Did well, do differently. So that's a feedback model that we use. And then the third thing I would say is that we really value good questions. It's more often that you'll hear somebody say, oh, that's such a good question. Then you'll hear somebody here say, that is a brilliant piece of knowledge that you just brought to our meeting, right? Like, it's just not the way people are rewarded here. So I think that makes a really big difference because knowledge is a commodity, right? And it's just not in today's world, and certainly not here. Inquiry is valued more than solution.
I like
Max,
that.
Max, can I say one other thing I thought about when Suzanne was talking that we do tactically at Rheaply that might also be helpful to build trust, but also starting from a place of like, I don't know. You know, I don't know. I don't have the answers to everything. I might know some things.
Yeah.
Some things I think I know, but I also am aware that they are probably wrong. Anyway, is communication. So I started writing a weekly. So, you know, we're always communicating to the public. You know, we communicate to the public. We also communicate to our investors in some type of recurring basis. I turn it inward and I started writing weekly updates to the team. And I had really three sections. What I'm excited about, what I'm learning, and what I'm nervous about. Those are the three sections
That's really
that I always have. We've grown a little bit, and I would boil over these words, and I would always start. No one has read this. There's no PR person. No one's proofed it. Right. If you see a mistake, it's mine, right? So I would boil over these things on Sundays afternoon, and then we got to a fundraise, and I couldn't keep it up. So now I've moved it to video, but I do the same thing. Is that I like people to hear from me. You know, I had this meeting with this person, and they said that worries me. And to hear that, or this person does, that's exciting. You know, and so I think even just at the edges for some companies, just communication that's human, that's not been through many levels of approval, allows you to buy that vulnerability and honesty from your employee base.
Yeah, it's like unfiltered humanity.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. I want to give just one shout out because I don't do it, but I'm really appreciative that it's done. Is that when Varun Agarwal became our SVP of operations, he immediately started incorporating full transparency on our financials at the staff meetings. And that was not something I did, not because I was trying to hide it from the team, but I just felt like, oh, they're not going to be interested. Like that feels like such a like low altitude thing, right? And Varn was like, no, like I really think people should know this and understand this. And, you know, I am so glad that he's done that. I think it makes a big difference. We're about to enter a fundraise now. I remember when Garry and I were walking down the street in San Francisco, and we were both like, don't you hate fundraising? Isn't it the worst? It's the worst. So now you know I'm about to, I'm literally starting right now another raise, and we're both like, I hate raises. But it helps to not just throw terms around, right? Like, the team needs to know. So I really think it's great that Varn's done that with our numbers.
By the way, there's a whole school of entrepreneurs who've been very, very successful who would never do what Suzanne just did. Because also, similar story, my CFO, she came to Rheaply. She's like, we're going to have town halls every month, and we're going to show that board deck to every single employee, which has our numbers, has everything.
Everything.
And I was like, oh my God, no. You know,
right,
so but I think that's a little bit of the newness of the future of work is if you are building highly motivated communities centered around a mission and a vision and obeying to core values, why not share how things are going? Because I might need you to pull another hour tonight so we can push that number, you know, or whatever it is. So it's evolved my thinking just in how the business landscape and how we have to work has also evolved.
You know, incidentally, there was a study done that talked about the most valued leadership traits, and transparency was up there.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and I will say this, I do agree, you know, it's different for each company, right? Because each company has a different DNA. It's got a different culture. And so for some companies, it may not make sense. But for those companies that it does make sense, for whom it does make sense, it really does get people to understand, okay, Garry needs me to stay an extra hour, but I know where it's all going. Like I know what we're trying to accomplish, and I get what role I play, and it gets people invested, which is so amazing, right? What I found interesting about what you said, Garry, was when you talked about the third piece of what you would communicate to your employees, which is what makes me nervous, right? Which shows your humanity, unfiltered humanity, right? So what I want to talk a little bit about is exactly that, because that's, you know, the name of the episode after all, right? More human. Suzanne, when you and I spoke a while back, you said being human takes a lot of work. And I'd love to know what that means to you and how you're applying that to your to Bonfire.
So I think sometimes the hardest thing to do, you know, we toss this phrase around like be yourself at work, right? Like be authentic. Like it's hard to do that because being human is a whole package of things, right? And, you know, to use Garry's language, it means showing that you're nervous, showing you're frustrated, showing you're angry, showing you're thrilled. Like there's so many human emotions. And it also means, yeah, you had a bad morning. It's very hard to shut that down. Being human means you don't shut it down, but you have to regulate it because there's, you know, there's so much to allow for a human organic ecosystem at work. It's hard work because work has to get done. You know, at the end of the day, we all remain employed because there's accountability to work getting done. So that is a lot to manage in one space, right? So when I say it's a lot of work, what I mean is you have to have the ability, I think, in a human space, just like you would, and I think a lot about parenting, right? Children are healthier emotionally and socially when there are boundaries, right? Unboundaried children don't know how to function well in society. So we really do need the boundaries at a workplace that are so clear and so specific that they do allow people to operate within them in a healthy way. And it's really hard to set those boundaries because, again, all of us are different. We're coming into work from different spaces and places, but we have to set them, and we have to be consistent and predictable and reward good behavior and note when behavior is not going well and be consistent with that, so that within those boundaries, people can actually, quote, be human. So that's why it's hard work, just like it's hard work being a parent.
That's the truth. Garry, when we spoke, you talked about how you spend a lot of time thinking about employee happiness.
Yes.
And it is, even if you go back 5 years, if you ask the average CEO, and this might be an overgeneralization, admittedly, but they might not put employee happiness at the top of their priority list. So why do you spend so much time thinking about employee happiness, and how does that inform your approach to your people?
I literally, it's the center of everything I do. And I've become really good friends with Mark Benioff, and I know he really thinks about customer happiness. So I intentionally say I really focus on my employees. You know why? Because they do all the work. I get too much credit for it. So there's a very straightforward business outcome, is that if people show up to work as their second home, they don't have the Sunday blues. Oh, I gotta go to work tomorrow. I'm excited to go to work tomorrow. I'm excited to tackle this. And when there are days where things aren't so great, to get a person who calls you, who sends you a funny thing by text, or who deems you something funny on one of the social apps, it maybe just at the edge changes the edge of how hard that day was, or how difficult that moment was for you to digest. And so I think people do the best, most creative, most productive work when they're happy. And I don't mean happy of ha ha smile all the time. I mean healthy. I mean ready. I mean focused. I mean their family is taken care of. I mean they are laser engaged. That sense of happiness. And so to me, it's a framework of me thinking about how my folks are actually doing. And so, and I think that drives everything else, because if they're good, that goodness is going to come off to the users and to our customers and to our investor stakeholders and to our partners. And they'll say things like they always say. I get these amazing emails. I love working with your people. They sent me this car when my wife was sick. How grateful I am for your people. I didn't tell them to send that car when one of our customers' wives was sick. They did it because they're engaged in the problem, because they're happy with their situation. And so what a day it would be. I had parents who had very hard jobs. I think I've had very hard jobs until this moment. What a day it could be to actually be happy at work. My goodness. And so I think it's my job to, as best I can with the resources that we have, to push for that for every employee.
And the data, by the way, backs up everything that Garry is saying, right? So happiness at work leads to engagement at work, which leads to going, when you ask, well, what will lead to an employee going above and beyond, right? In the moment where that's necessary, it's engagement. What leads to engagement? Happiness, right? So it's a virtuous cycle. So there's data to back all of that up.
And Max, can I say that what I found is I don't even know how scalable this is. I honestly don't. Obviously we're trying to hire executives who have a similar thinking. But I think it's so crucial that people, even when they leave this company, right, they go off and do something even grander, that they say on their resume, and this is actually the thing that I measure my own success by. I'm proud of that work.
Yeah.
I was happy there. I know what I'm getting to by leaving. That's super, super important. And I think if that message is told to employees, we have a very low churn rate at Rheaply. We get hundreds of applications for a couple of spots when we hire. That isn't all just me. It's people seeing people who worked here talk about their happiness. And by the way, I see this in other cultures too. And I've stolen things from the jellyvision culture. Of course, I look up and worship everything Amanda Every does and says. So to me,
did you hear that, Max? Did you
I
hear
did.
how
I'm
much?
staying totally quiet.
But I think that it's not dissociated from revenue growth. It's not dissociated from, we're an impact company, like making an impact to climate, to carbon, to waste. It's not dissociated from that. It's because of it. So I think it's important that people are happy at a company that's in a new market, that's in a new product space, because they're building it. I'm not. My only job is to really think about keeping the lights on and keeping them happy. My job is not easy, but it's straightforward.
And I'm going to say, because we talk to our women about this all the time, Garry and I, because we run mission-driven companies, should not be the only CEOs who think this way. Because we can't have Bonfire women who work at traditional companies think, oh, well, you two think that way because your companies have a purpose. They're purpose-driven, or they're entrepreneurial, or of course, you're thinking that way because of who you are and how you approach the world. No. Right? So I don't want to suggest that Garry thinks this way, I think this way, because our companies, this is possible anywhere.
Absolutely.
Any company, any CEO. The question of whether it's scalable is somewhat of a different conversation, because scale of anything is hard, but it shouldn't be tied to only purpose-driven companies.
Right. The question of scale is something that you'll, if all goes well, both have to grapple with, but certainly shooting for the stars and having the right intent from the very beginning is critical. And I think, Suzanne, to your earlier point, engaged employees are everything. The worst thing you can have is an employee who is disengaged. That's actually worse than an employee that overtly dislikes what they're doing, because that person is easier to spot. The person that's disengaged, they're just not really trying. And so there comes a point for every employee at which they can say, I'm going to put in a little more effort, versus I've done what I'm supposed to do, right? I don't need to send a card. I don't need to, go above and beyond. And that mini decision that gets made by every employee so many times a day is really a function of and informed by how they feel about the people they work with, the culture, the internal side of the coin, and then how they feel about the mission of the organization that they work for, and that's the external side of the coin. I want to just touch on real estate for a little bit. When we talk about being human and the humanity inherent in all companies that sort of understand its importance, the built environment, the workplace, is an important piece of that. Whether or not you're hybrid, to whatever extent you're hybrid, the role of the office is obviously going to evolve. It has to, but there is a role for it in many companies. And so what I want to understand is, how do you define the human environment, and how are you creating it for your people? Suzanne, why don't we start with you?
So I shared recently on LinkedIn, because it was so visual to me, but this office was originally, as I said, designed for scale, right? It was designed for 100+ women to be here at least once a month in a classroom. It's possible in 2023, even though our women are global, that we will start to do more large scale events like that on a regular basis. But right now, it's the team who spends the most amount of space here. But in the middle of our office, there's this waterfall table, it's a long table, and it's got, a dozen seats down both sides. And there's a lot of other spaces to work. There are private offices, there are cluster places for people to sit. And whenever I come in here, the entire team is out on the waterfall table, just working together. Music is on. They're all here on the days they're here. And that's how they like to work. And I'm always shocked, because I'm an introvert and working like that doesn't work for me. both because it feels like a lot of small talk, but also just I need quiet. And so it just is shocking to me. But I love the fact that this waterfall table is here. It invites people to there are high boy chairs. It invites people to come sit down. All of the other seating is cluster seating. Like it literally invites you to come sit down with two people. You almost feel strange if you're sitting there alone. We had a lot of conversation about coffee when we first, like the quality of it. It took us 2.5, almost 3 years for somebody to raise their hand and go, the coffee we thought so much about sucks. Can we please just get an espresso machine? Everybody was really happy with that. So we talk a lot about that. We share a lot of meals in the office. So there's a lot of meal sharing that goes on. It's rare for people when they're here in the office together to eat alone. That is not, so there's a lot of space here for people to sit down and have a meal together. That's something we really think about. And the last thing I'll say is, to me, natural light is everything.
Yeah.
So, if you're going to spend time inside, that's not at your home, because a lot of people's homes prioritize natural light, then the office has to do that too.
Yeah. I was taking some notes and thinking of some things that we could do better. So I think this is a continued Rubik's Cube that we spin at Rheaply. So we have a physical workspace. We're not getting rid of it. It's a workspace that's flex, meaning we have a central office in Chicago, but we also have offices in LA, San Francisco, and New York because of our office in Chicago. So, and we strategically hire out of those markets so people can kind of go in. That's, I think, kind of very foundational and grounded. But we do a lot of planning around how do we gather. So if you take it from just meeting, like, how do we gather? A gathering could be this on Sunday, I went and I had lunch with our CTO and we just caught up. Of course, we're going to talk about business, but we caught about life. We went and had a burger together. All the way to, we have executive planning sessions or product team will go off on a retreat. So what we really try to do is we try to create budgetary space where we have those resources. Sometimes actually people just use their own to either meet up in the office or meet at the office to then go somewhere else and to gather and to commune and to share and to do what we're going to do. And honestly, we've not put more structure around it than that. Just to have budget, have some type of space, and let people be creative and find the niches and corners of their communities and their world that makes sense for them to meet it for whatever their problems that they're trying to solve or for whatever they want to feel from other people. I specifically try to go to every single one of those metros and have dinner with our employees there. So for instance, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Seattle and I'll meet with our customers in Seattle, but importantly, I'll hang out with the 4 people who work at Rheaply who live in Seattle. So I think it's, I don't think it's, for me, for Rheaply, it hasn't been about reducing our footprint. It's been about how do we gather? And are we okay with me going to the Seattle office and having fun with the Seattle folks? Or are we going to be as restrictive and say we're all remote or we're all in one office? So really our theme has just been to be flexible for our culture and to be flexible for what people need. And obviously there's always resource constraints, but to working within those, to be able to just find ways that we actually can share something that's a human exchange when we're actually in front of each other, whether it's over a meal, whether that's over a comedy show, or whether that's in some office trying to whiteboard some problem that we're facing in the company.
And it's always at its core adapting to continuously changing inputs, right?
Yeah.
Which is so important.
Yeah, I mean, to me, always when I think about future work, I don't think it means less work. I think the future work means more work. So the question is, where are you doing that work? And how are you doing that? And so we try to think about, well, if people are like always working, if it's in their homes with their dogs and with their kids, then we have to allow for them to be able to work, quote unquote, to be able to share with their colleagues wherever they are. And I think that problem set, again, continues to find new frontiers for us. But it's one that I think really every company should be thinking about as like an office is the baseline. I think you have to think about how do people engage with the office? How do you get people to come to the office? And how do you get people who aren't local to those offices? How do you have them have the same kind of engagement as you do for the people who are more proximal to physical office spaces? So we think that's a larger category of gathering and championing people who want to get together and to share and to make progress.
I have so many follow-up questions. I feel like we're going to have to do a part 2 of this. But with just a couple of minutes left here, I just have one last question, which is, we talked a lot about sort of vulnerability and learning as a leader. So with that in mind, if you had 5 minutes with your 2019 self, what would you say to your 2019 self? And no, you can't say, I'm going to buy Zoom stock. What else would you say?
Suzanne.
What would I have said? That's really hard, because in 2019, I was raising the money to do the seed round for Bonfire. So I don't think I would have said not to do that, right? So are you saying knowing what I know now?
Yes, that knowing what you know now, what would you have said to your 2019 self in terms of the leadership aspect of what you did?
So first of all, I would have said raise more money, right? So that I had more, I would have said raise more money so that I had a longer, so that I could make different choices. I would have said that I needed to account a lot more for mental health during that time, my own and the team's. I did not account for my own mental health during that time, full stop. I was teaching full-time at Kellogg and launching Bonfire and running it as the CEO and trying to keep, and so I had zero mental health capacity, and I was not good at acknowledging it for the team because I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what we were going through. My sole focus was keeping the company alive. So I would have told myself, read a lot, understand a lot about the mental health impact of a pandemic, and figure out what it's going to mean for your people, and figure out what kind of resources you're going to need to keep the company alive and support your people appropriately during this time. Right? That's what I would have told myself.
I think, one, I have to 100% align myself to the point about mental health, both for me and for the company. We now have, a retainer staffed person who any employee can reach out to, and we don't know about that, and that the company pays for it. And that was one of the big issues after the pandemic, is just people losing that sense of belonging, losing that sense of connection, and us not being able to solve that because we're all trying to figure out how to keep the companies alive. And to Suzanne's point, 2019 was a really hard year for me because, Rheaply had been operating for about 3.5 years. Until that time, we hadn't even raised an aggregate of more than $1 million. So, most seed rounds are north of $1 million, $1.5 million. Right. And we, in 3.5 years of operations, hadn't done that, even though we had Google as a customer and other things. So I was at one point trying to keep the company alive. On the other hand, thinking, I don't know how to solve that. Right. Yes, I have a degree in neuroscience, but I don't have a degree in psychiatry or psychology. And I also can't be your boss and your psychologist. Right. So I think I want to align myself to that. I think the thing that I walk away with is a theme that I would tell myself back then is simple: write it down. I've played the violin since I was 6. And there's a common saying in orchestras that amateurs remember and pros write it down. How are we going to have our bows here? I'm going to write it down. And I can tell you, going from 7 people in one room and not really writing anything down to completely remote. The things that I could have written, the things that we could have written. So now we are very good at writing things down at Rheaply. We are very good at documentation. We're very good at that kind of structure. And, if you read some of our documents at Rheaply, there's always a delight because that's one of our values. So you'll read a joke as you're reading some, very long product documentation somewhere. But just writing it down would be something I would tell myself in 2019.
Totally. It's, as entrepreneurs, as humans, a lot of us are eternal optimists. I think the two of you definitely are. I know I am. And how great is it to, among some of the darkness out there, that we can find the light of, here's the silver lining from the pandemic and what we learned, right? And now that the crisis is maybe behind us in some sense, that our feedback loop and reaction time can go from what do I need to tackle in the next day that's so pressing to the next week, the next month, the next year. And then you start planning for the long run. And I think that's kind of the ultimate goal. That's how we can make more of a difference, is plan for the long run. So, guys, this has been outstanding. I love the conversation. Suzanne Muchin and Garry Cooper, I appreciate you both. Thank you very much for joining. And thanks to everyone else for tuning in to the future of work and more human. And we will talk to you next time.